Okay, so good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on airborne chemical exposure assessments awareness with a federal sector focus. My name is Jessica Major, and I will be your co-host and co-presenter for our virtual session today. Before we get started, let me take you through some webinar housekeeping. Please note that all lines will remain muted throughout the session, and you will not have the ability to turn your camera on. So first off, computer audio is recommended. Phone conference audio only available is required, or if required. A headset earbuds are recommended for a better audio experience. Please mute other devices and apps to avoid distractions. You can use the chat conversation for real-time messages and responding to instructor questions. Chat messages are seen by all participants. Please keep your microphone muted unless you need to speak. Uh, in terms of the conversation and chat, that can be featured, it's featured on the right and can be used at various times and is public. It may be used to enter your response to questions asked by us. Any questions that we raise or that you raise, you can certainly put that in the chat and it will give you the option to communicate with other attendees as well. So during the presentation, you can adjust your view of the content. So you can see on the bottom right here, the dot, dot, dot. So to maximize your view of the presentation, click on the More Actions menu button and select Enter Full Screen. So we'd like to make this session as interactive as possible for you, and we will have several polling questions throughout the session. These may be multiple choice, a short answer. So you can send questions again to us during the session through the chat feature. And this may be used also again to respond to some of our questions or for comments. Okay. And with that, let's begin. Morning, everyone. Again, my name is Jessica Major. I'll be your co-host and co-presenter for our session today. It's Airborne Chemical Exposure Assessments Awareness with a federal sector focus. I also have here today Warren Clements, who will be co-hosting and co-presenting the Safety Connection. So, highlights from Warren's background. Warren has a Bachelor of Science in Human Biology, his degree from the University of Guelph, Ontario. Um, Warren has worked in the health and safety field for over 30 years. He's worked in the manufacturing sector, the insurance industry as a health and safety and risk control consultant. He's both a certified industrial hygienist or CIH with the Board for Global EHS Credentialing since 2003 and a Canadian Registered Safety Professional, CRSP, with the Board of Canadian Registered Safety Professionals since 2013. He's completed numerous air, noise, indoor air quality, and heat stress exposure assessments, mostly under Ontario provincial and Canadian federal jurisdictions, but several other provinces as well. In addition, he's created numerous occupational hygiene programs to support the above assessments. At WSPS, he is the Specialized Services Lead for Occupational Hygiene and provides thought leadership and technical guidance for the occupational hygiene practice. He partners with 8 WSPS staff who provide occupational hygiene services primarily across Ontario, but outside Ontario's borders as well.
Thanks so much, Jessica, for that kind introduction. Now it's my turn to introduce Jessica. So Jessica is my coworker, and she has a master's in applied science degree in occupational health from McGill University in Montreal, Quebec. And she is also a certified industrial hygienist with the Board of Global EHS Credentialing. Jessica's worked in the health and safety field since 2013. She's worked in the manufacturing sector and has provided occupational health, safety, and hygiene consulting for various workplaces under Canadian federal, provincial, and municipal jurisdictions, not limited to government, utilities, construction, manufacturing, services, healthcare, pharmaceuticals, education, and office workplaces. in various provinces and territories throughout Canada. At WSPS, she's the specialized consultant in occupational hygiene and provides technical services on behalf of the OC hygiene practice for the North and East regions of Ontario. So again, both Jessica and I are so appreciative of the opportunity to share this information with you today and hope it's beneficial. Lots of information to cover today, so let's get started. So the agenda includes a review of select WSIB occupational disease claims data, potential health effects from airborne chemical exposures, a review of the Canadian federal regulatory framework, including Canada Labour Code, some key regulations and potential future regulatory amendments, some methods for controlling hazards, exploring the interpretations, policies, and guidelines, or IPGs, as you might know them, from the Canada Labour Program, share some contact mechanisms for federal government labor program labor affair officers, highlight some key points on the National Joint Council, or NJC. That's not a familiar term. Hopefully at the end of our webinar it will be, and share some specific airborne chemical sampling and analysis consideration, some useful guides, references, and finally, at the end, a list of references. But we did say it was going to be interactive, so I'm going to start with poll number 1 for today. So, has your employer conducted an airborne chemical exposure assessment in your workplace? And so, for purposes of the question, it really doesn't matter whether it's an outside third party that did the exposure assessment or whether it was internal. Count this as yes either way. So I'm seeing the answers roll in. Leading response is A, yes, 45%. The second leading is not sure or not aware, 23%. No is 18%, and answer D does not apply. So anyway, thanks so much for your participation so far. I still see responses rolling in. And again, leading response is yes from 41% of you. And for the no and the 21%, it might be worth consideration. So usually in cases where people say it does not apply, it might be an office environment that you're working in, and that makes sense to me. There's potential for indoor air quality type concerns, but you don't see an application for yourself. All right. Thanks for your responses so much. But for those that are answered no, it might be a consideration in the future. Okay. So I'm not an expert on WSIB data, but this information illustrates that employees are making OC disease claims, and these claims are being allowed. So this is current Ontario Workplace Safety and Insurance Board, or WSIB data. It's obtained from WSIB directly. In the past, I reached out to WSIB and made a call and said, hey, can you help walk me through your website? Now I just use the website myself and get updated information for this presentation. So big picture. This bar chart shows OC disease claim counts. OC disease includes chronic exposures and effects, noise-induced hearing loss, COVID-19, acute exposures and effects, long latency illness, and claims not coded. No employer-specific information is provided. In the title, you'll see combined Schedule 1 and Schedule 2. These are WSIB terms. This includes Ontario-based provincially regulated employers and workplaces in Ontario that are federally regulated. There's no data outside Ontario. Again, this slide shows all OC diseases. The blue bar is allowed claim counts by calendar year. The data was pulled on September 14th, 2023, just last week, and the slide shows the data to be current as of July 31st, 2023. July 31st, sorry, 2023. So what do I see? In general, claim counts are going up year over year. Obviously, calendar year 2023 is a partial year, so it's hard to compare against previous years. But you may have an initial thought, isn't the overall Ontario population going up? And doesn't this likely translate to more workers in the workforce in Ontario? And I think fair point, yes. So also, isn't the Ontario workforce also an aging workforce? And so maybe there's more time for long latency claims to develop. And I guess, yes, it's also a fair point. But the key message, big picture, allowed claims are real and rising. So now I'm going to pass this speaker baton to my colleague, Jessica. Take it from here, Jessica.
Great. Thank you so much, Warren. So now let's get into the whys of this subject matter, why airborne chemical exposure assessments are so important at the workplace. And to emphasize again, this safety connection is at the awareness level, so it is truly a high level overview of this topic. So the human respiratory system. The Canadian Centre for Occupational Safety and Health states that people involved in hard physical work will breathe harder and take in more than 6 liters of air a minute. Over an 8-hour working day, more than 2,800 liters of air will be breathed in and out of the lungs. In conditions of hard physical work, up to 10,000 liters may be exchanged. So imagine now that that air you're breathing in is contaminated with a substance or mixture of substances. They could be in the form of particulate matter, vapors, or gases. How do you know if that substance is hazardous? How do you assess for this? I'll be addressing this in later slides. So, inhalation is the most important route of exposure in the workplace. So, when you have those particles in the air, there's a chance that you will inhale them. When you breathe in contaminated air, how are particulates, for example, deposited in the lungs? Does it matter? It really does. So, various chemical substances can be toxic depending on how far they get into your respiratory system and the particular toxic properties of those particulates. So, when you're looking at occupational exposure limits for various airborne chemical substances, a number of them may indicate that the inhalable size fraction is hazardous for that substance, or the thoracic or respirable particulate size fraction. So, for inhalable particulate matter, this refers to particulate matter with an aerodynamic diameter of 100 microns or less, and it's hazardous when deposited anywhere in the respiratory tract. For thoracic particulate matter, this refers to the particulate matter with an aerodynamic diameter of 10 microns or less, and it's hazardous when deposited anywhere in the lung airways or the gas exchange region or the lower passages of the airways. And then for respirable particulate matter, this refers to particulate matter with an aerodynamic diameter of 4 microns or less, so even smaller. And they're hazardous when deposited anywhere in that gas exchange region. Now, for particulate monitoring to be meaningful at the workplace, sampling should be based on the nature of exposure to humans. So, many occupational diseases are associated with the location where inhalable hazardous airborne particles are deposited. Therefore, health based particle sampling should reflect how particles penetrate and deposit in the various regions of the human respiratory system. The health effects from airborne chemical exposures. So, exposures to airborne chemicals can affect all systems in the body. So, skeletal, muscular, nervous, endocrine, cardiovascular, lymphatic, respiratory, digestive, urinary, and the reproductive system. So, a person may experience irritation, shortness of breath, chronic cough, dermal sensitization, respiratory sensitization, cancer, or even death. The International Labor Organization has a publication titled Exposure to Hazardous Chemicals at the Workplace and Resulting Health Impacts, a global review. It provides an analysis of global trends and priorities when it comes to protecting the health and safety of occupational chemical exposures from chemicals such as asbestos, silica, heavy metals such as lead and mercury, solvents, dyes, pesticides, and much more. It's a really great read to understand what is or has been done with respect to these substances and the primary health impacts, global burden of occupational exposures, work related health impact, policy measures, action for policymakers, occupational exposure limits, and provides examples of practical workplace interventions. So, the Canadian regulatory framework. There are two possible sources of federal government legislation, and the focus for today is on the Justice Law's website. So, many of you may have seen and used the site extensively. So, here's a visual of what I see when I first open the Justice Law's site. Another source is the Canadian Legal Information Institute, which is a credible source as well. It retains reputable network services providers that comply with best practices in this industry's confidentiality undertaking. It's a nonprofit organization created and funded by the Federation of Law Societies of Canada in 2001 on behalf of its 14 member societies. And the information is regularly updated. So statutes and regulations are regularly uploaded once a month from the websites of official publishers. So let's go deeper into the Justice Law's website. So on the left-hand side, you can see the consolidated acts. The Canada Labour Code is one example. So you can see as well the consolidated regulations with the Canada Occupational Health and Safety Regulations as one example. So finding the Canada Labour Code. There's more than one way to do this. I can type a search in Find a Title, or you can find it under Frequently Accessed Acts. Once you've opened the Canada Labour Code, then you will see this large table of contents. So you scroll down to 1220 here, Part 2, Occupational Health and Safety, which is shown on the next slide here. So now let's really focus in on part two. Interpretations are key occupational health and safety definitions. It includes information on hazardous substance, health and safety representative, workplace and workplace committee. Under duties of employers, there are general duties and specific duties. The only general duty of employer in Section 124, it states every employer shall ensure that the health and safety at work of every person employed by the employer is protected. So you might call this the general duty clause. There are many specific duties of the employer. So Section 125, it's not shown here in the table of contents, but it's evident under Section 124 in the actual content of the legislation. So one specific item to share from that, where the employer needs to develop, implement, and monitor in consultation with the policy committee, or if there's no policy committee, with the workplace committee or the health and safety representative, a prescribed program for the prevention of hazards in the workplace appropriate to its size and the nature of the hazards in it, that also provides for the education of employees in health and safety matters. Now focusing on part two, occupational health and safety, section 134. So for the purposes of addressing health and safety matters that apply to the work, undertaking, or business of an employer, every employer who normally employs directly 300 or more employees shall establish a policy health and safety committee and, subject to section 135.1, select and appoint its members. So what is our understanding? If the employer has two sites, each with 200 employees for a total of 400 employees, they meet this criteria. There is a lot of content in section 134, and one other specific item are participating in the development of health and safety policies and programs. All these duties relate to all health and safety. And workplace health and safety committees. Again, there is considerable content. A marginal note, the establishment is mandatory. To address health and safety, every employer with 20 or more employees shall establish a workplace health and safety committee. So for the purposes of addressing health and safety matters that apply to individual workplaces and subject to this section, every employer shall, for each workplace controlled by the employer at which 20 or more employees are normally employed, establish a workplace health and safety committee and, subject to section 135.1, select and appoint its members. So select parts of section 135 here, a workplace health and safety committee, as you can see in the slide. So I am paraphrasing. Section 135(7)(e) indicates the workplace health and safety committee member shall participate in inquiries, investigations, studies, and inspections. So this covers occupational hygiene testing, such as the airborne chemical exposure assessments. Um, so before I go on, just want to mention for smaller employers, Section 136, health and safety representatives, um, a marginal note for appointment of a health and safety representative. So every employer shall, with fewer than 20 employees, appoint a health and safety representative for that workplace. So I'm just paraphrasing there. We've taken a look at the Canada Labour Code and Act, and focusing on the regulations, there are many. Um, so you can find them. You search under find a title if you know the title, or again, you can click on the frequently accessed regulations under the Canada Occupational Health and Safety Regulations. So this is the start of the table of contents under the Canada Occupational Health and Safety Regulations. This is intended to make it more visual. So the uh, Canada Occupational Health and Safety Regulations, or COHSR, Part 1 is shown here. The hazardous substances is under Part 10, and hazard prevention program is under Part 19. So today we've selected to examine the Canada Occupational Health and Safety Regulations. This may be a more common federal regulation, but be aware that there are other specific regulations that may apply for workplace applications such as aviation, maritime, onboard trains. So a few of the other regulations are shown here in the slide. So now we're focusing in on COHSR, Part 10, Hazardous Substances, and Part 19, Hazard Prevention Program. So this slide shows just a snip of the overall section headings for Part 10. In this part of the regulation, certain chemical agents other than airborne green dust, airborne flour dust, and airborne asbestos fibers must not be in excess of the value for that chemical agent as adopted by the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists in its publication entitled Threshold Limit Values, or TLVs, and Biological Exposure Indices, or BEIs, as amended from time to time, which means the most current of this publication must be used. The occupational exposure limit of airborne grain dust has been identified on its own in the regulation, and airborne concentrations at the workplace must not exceed an average of 4 milligrams per cubic meter across an 8-hour shift. And airborne flour dust has been identified on its own as well, where the average concentration of airborne flour dust must not exceed 3 milligrams per cubic meter across an 8-hour shift. Asbestos has been pulled out into a separate section involving an asbestos exposure management program. But there's more to come on regulated occupational exposure limits for federal workplaces in future slides. So this slide here shows a snip of the overall headings for Part 19, Hazard Prevention Program. We have the Hazard Prevention Program and a description of it, an implementation plan, hazard identification and assessment methodology, hazard identification and assessment, preventive measures, employee training, program evaluation, and reports. So we'll have our second poll question of the day. So do you know where you can seek out proposed changes to Canadian federal legislation regarding the Canada Occupational Health and Safety Regulations? Okay, so we have a lot of responses here. Yes, that's fantastic. It's really great to know where you can find your legislation. Sometimes it can be a little difficult to navigate. So 67% about saying yes, and about 33% saying no. So that's great. Thanks so much. All right. So on the previous slides, it was mentioned that stakeholders they may be able to comment on proposed regulations. So they may do this when they're pre-published in Part 1 of the Canada Gazette. So this is anticipated by the winter end of the fiscal year. Um, so what is the Canada Gazette? The Canada Gazette is the official newspaper of the Government of Canada. So you can learn about new statutes, new and proposed regulations, and more. There is a link that will be provided in the reference list. And you can see an example of a recent Canada Gazette, which is snipped on the right-hand side of the slide. So I mentioned earlier that there are proposed changes to Canadian federal legislation. So information about the proposed changes is posted in a document titled Labor Program Forward Regulatory Plan 2022 to 2024. And the link is provided, and again, it will be in the reference list. A snip of the Labor Program Forward Regulatory Plan documentation is shown here in the slide. So when did preliminary consultations with targeted external stakeholders first get started? The labor program held their preliminary consultations with the stakeholders in May 2019, August 2019, and January 2020. So how does this apply to the Canada Occupational Health and Safety Regulations Part 10? Well, we have the objective to improve the health and safety of employees by updating exposure limits and regulatory requirements for specific hazardous agents like thermal stress, nanoparticles, and ultraviolet radiation. And for airborne chemical substances, there are two more points that I would like to mention that are in the proposed updates, such as one, clarifying ambiguous regulatory text to reflect best practices, and two, improving consistency with other provisions within the aviation occupational health and safety regulations, the Canada Occupational Health and Safety Regulations, maritime occupational health and safety regulations, oil and gas occupational health and safety regulations, on board trains occupational health and safety regulations under Part 2 of the Canada Labour Code, and Health Canada guidelines. Now, let's get down to the parts of the Canada Occupational Health and Safety Regulations, or the COHSR, that you would really look to when reviewing hazardous substances at your workplace. First, you have Part 10, hazardous substances, and then Part 19, the hazard prevention program. So in Part 10, Section 10.3 states that every employer shall keep a record of all hazardous substances that are used, produced, handled, or stored for use in the workplace, and may either keep such a record in the workplace or keep a centralized record in respect of several workplaces in one workplace. So, bottom line, you need to know what chemicals you have at the workplace, period. Where can you find this information? You have examples like purchasing records, warehouse or stockroom inventories, and safety data sheets. You need to know, how are these products being used on site? How are they handled? How are they stored? Now in section 10.4, which is the bare minimum that's required for a hazard investigation, subsection 1 states, if the health and safety of an employee is likely to be endangered by exposure to a hazardous substance in a workplace, the employer shall, without delay, appoint a qualified person to carry out an investigation in that regard, and for the purposes of providing for the participation of the workplace committee or the health and safety representative of the investigation, notify either of the proposed investigation and of the name of the qualified person appointed to carry out that investigation. So the qualified person conducting the investigation needs to have that knowledge, training, and experience to perform the duty safely and properly. And the workplace committee or the workplace or the health and safety representative need to be informed, involved in the investigation conducted by that qualified person. It should be a conversation. So questions should be asked, responses should be provided so that the workplace committee or health and safety representative has that understanding of why the investigation is being performed and how it can impact employees. Also part of the minimum requirements, we have section 10.4, subsection 2, an investigation referred to in subsection 1, following the criteria shall be taken into consideration. So the chemical, biological, and physical properties of the hazardous substance, the routes of exposure to the hazardous substance, the acute and chronic effects on the health of exposure to the hazardous substance, the quantity of the hazardous substance to be handled, the manner in which the hazardous substance is stored, used, handled, and disposed of. So, again, you need to know what you're working with at the workplace. How much of it is being handled? How are you handling it? And really, from start to finish, how that substance moves from storage to the employee and how it leaves the workplace. So continuing on from section 10.4, subsection 2, the investigation must also include um, the control methods used to eliminate or reduce exposure of employees to the hazardous substance, the concentration or level of the hazardous substance to which the employee is likely to be exposed, whether the concentration of an airborne chemical agent or the level of ionizing or non-ionizing radiation is likely to exceed 50% of the values referred to in subsection 10.19.1, etc. Whether the level referred to in paragraph G is likely to exceed or be less than that prescribed in part 6. So some examples of control methods may be local exhaust ventilation, employee rotation, or use of personal protective equipment such as respirators. With respect to the concentration, this may be achieved through airborne chemical air sampling to determine what the concentration of the substance is in the air. So you may see the numbers presented in milligrams per cubic meter or parts per million as an example. So remember in section 10.41a, the employer needs to appoint a qualified person. So is there a definition for qualified in the code or regulation? Yes, there is. In the COHSR, under Part 1, under interpretations, you will see a definition for qualified person. So you can see in the slide there, qualified person means in respect of a specific duty, a person who, because of his knowledge, training, and experience, is qualified to perform that duty safely and properly. So 10.6, or excuse me, 10.5 here. So on completion of an investigation referred to in subsection 10.41, and after consultation with the workplace committee or the health and safety representative. So again, it's an ongoing discussion. The qualified persons shall set out in a written report signed by the qualified person the person's observations respecting the criteria considered in accordance with subsection 10.42 and the qualified person's recommendations respecting the manner of compliance with sections 10.7 to 10.26, including recommendations representing or respecting sampling and testing methods. So the employer shall establish and keep up to date written procedures for the controlling of the concentration or level of the hazardous substance in the workplace and make it readily available for examination by employees in any form as determined in consultation with the policy committee, or if there's no policy committee, the workplace committee, or the health and safety representatives. So the employers do really need to keep the employees informed of what's in the air at their workplace, what was used to do that sampling, testing, what recommendations were put in place. Um, it really needs, again, to be that ongoing conversation. And then in 10.6, which is not shown here, a report referred to in section 10.5 shall be kept by the employer for a period of 30 years after the date on which the qualified person signed the report. So here we have 10.7, one medical examinations. So if a report referred to in section 10.5 recommends a medical examination, or the employee is likely to be exposed to a hazardous substance, um, the employer shall consult a physician to ascertain the necessity for that medical examination. So there's a bit more detail there in 10.7 about medical examinations, just with respect to the physician, what the physician would do as well within that medical examination. Um, and then in 10.14, so every employer shall, in consultation with the policy committee, or if there's no policy committee, the workplace committee or health and safety representative, develop and implement an employee education and training program with respect to hazard prevention and control at the workplace. So remember, anything to do with occupational health and safety and occupational hygiene should involve conversations with those who know the processes and tasks. And that includes how employees are educated and trained on the hazard prevention and the controls for those at the workplace. So you can see here in 10.14, subsection 2, the employee education and training program shall include um, the education and training of each employee who handles or is exposed to or is likely to handle or be exposed to the hazardous substance with respect to the product identifier. We have the hazard information disclosed by the supplier or the employer on the safety data sheet or label, all hazard information of which the employer is aware or ought to be aware, the observations referred to in subparagraph 10.5AI, the information disclosed on a safety data sheet referred to in section 10.28, and the purpose and significance of that information. And when respect to hazardous products in the workplace, the information required to be disclosed on a safety data sheet and on a label under Division 3, and the purpose and significance of that information. So a lot of requirements there to consider. Now, we come to employee education and training. So every employer shall, in consultation with the policy committee, or if there's no policy committee, the workplace committee or the health and safety representative, review and, if necessary, revise the employee education and training program. So this is at least once a year whenever there is a change in conditions. So that's quite important. So production levels, operation levels have increased at the workplace. There's different equipment on site. There are more workers performing various tasks on site. Change in the hazardous substances. And whenever there's new hazard information, in respect of the hazardous substances used at that workplace, whenever that becomes available to the employer. All that needs to be taken into consideration when you're looking at the education and training of those employees. Again, they need to be informed of what they're working with, right? Um, because those can have further implications, right? Such as what kind of engineering, administrative, or PPE controls that will be required. So we'll review those later on in this presentation. So here we have the control of hazards. So in 10.19, an employee shall be kept free from exposure to a concentration of an airborne chemical agent other than airborne grain dust, airborne flour dust, and airborne asbestos fibers in excess of the value for that chemical agent that's in that publication, threshold limit values and biological exposure indices published by the ACGIH, the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists. So that's this booklet that's issued every year, and there are amendments to it that are made. Um, but we basically need to abide by those values that are listed in there. With the exception of that, airborne grain dust, the flour dust, and asbestos fibers, if there are just differences there. So that's one of the key resources that we'll use to make sure that what you're exposed to at the workplace and in your workplace air is at a good level. So we have poll question number 3 here. What is the highest level of exposure category relative to the occupational exposure limits like threshold limit value or TWA? So that's a limit that's an average, or excuse me, an average over the 8 hours. So it could be, let's say, 10 milligrams per cubic meter, that average across an 8-hour workday. Then we have short-term exposure limit. So those are really for those 15-minute, let's say, task-based exposures. And then we have ceiling limits, representative as C here, where you can never exceed that limit at your site. So at your workplace, do you have more task-based exposures, or do you have more general exposures throughout your workday, or do you have some tasks which are so brief that your exposure might be the highest at those sort of single points? So if you can provide a response to the poll, that would be great.
And Jessica, I see 20 responses have rolled in so far, and it looks like the leading one is no, don't know or not sure. 60% of you were in that category. But I also see that the second leading one, there's some people are at or equal to 100% of the occupational exposure limit, and some are less than or equal to 10% of the occupational exposure limit, but less than 50%. So
Perfect.
interesting to hear about some of the people
Yeah.
that are over the occupational exposure limit. There's a challenge, and we'll probably touch on this some more in future slides.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. So for those who don't know or not sure, definitely a great idea to have a conversation with your health and safety committees there to make sure that you're in the know, right? You have a right to know about what's being handled at the workplace and what safety measures have been put in place to protect your overall health and safety. So thanks so much, Warren, for that. Um, so if we move on to the next slide here, so we have those control of hazards. If the concentration of the airborne chemical agent is likely to exceed the value referred to in subsection 1, air samples shall be taken and the concentration of the chemical agent shall be determined, right? We need to know what the concentration is in the air if it's expected that that concentration is going to exceed those values in the that threshold limit values and biological exposure indices booklet from the ACGIH. A paper or electronic record of each of those tests made up under subsection 3 shall be kept by the employer at the employer's place of business that is nearest to the workplace where the air sample is taken for a period of 3 years after the date of the test. What should that record include? The date, time, and location of the test, the hazardous substance in respect of which the test was made, the sampling and testing method used, the result obtained, and the name and occupation of the person who made the test. So ideally, it would be against that qualified person who has that knowledge, training, and experience. But as well, there are certified industrial hygienists, registered occupational hygienists who can perform those tests, perform those assessments, or at least persons who are under the direction of a CIH or ROH. Now let's look at two more of the practical aspects of how we would conduct these assessments. So we have different types of assessment methods here that are shown. On the left-hand side, you can see here we have an air sampling pump. So a worker may be wearing this for, let's say, 15 minutes of the day, or they might wear it for their full work day, something that might be fitted onto the side or the back of their body, maybe hung on their belt, as an example. And then we have here a piece of media that we might use. Now, there are a variety of different types of media, um, and they may collect different types of agents, different size fractions of agents. But sometimes we will put a piece of media like this and connect it to this air sampling pump, connect it to the tubing. It will collect the agent onto a filter, let's say, just as an example, and then we'll send that sample off to a lab. They'll perform a specific analysis on it and give us the results of what that average concentration was over the period that we were doing the sampling. Now we want to make sure that our our air sampling pumps are running up to par and exactly at the flow rates that we want them to be collecting the air. So this is an example of a calibrator that we might use to, let's say, ensure that this pump is running at 2 liters per minute or running at 4 liters per minute or much less than that. So this is another tool that we would use. For other agents, such as certain volatile organic compounds, we might have something like a badge, an air sampling badge. A lot easier to put on a worker, very light. Um, Ideally, if we can find a badge that works well for what we're sampling, that's great. We'll put this on the worker. But basically, it's a type of passive sampling. The worker wouldn't have to wear a pump like this for their workday. And then we have other specific types of units for a variety of different agents. So this one specifically is for formaldehyde. So it can give you some average concentrations, and even short-term sort of measurements. If you do use formaldehyde at the workplace or there is off-gassing, let's say, at the workplace, this is another tool we could use. Um, so the ESDC labor program, they have this occupational chemical agent compliance sampling guideline. We won't be going over this during today's safety connection, but there may be elements from this guideline that align with a qualified person's sampling strategy. Um, I would recommend using this guideline more so to ask the right questions to a qualified person before they conduct that assessment or they create that sampling strategy. Um, we don't particularly adhere to everything in this guideline, but again, I would recommend using it just to generate those questions that you might have and present them to that qualified person. They may say, that's an interesting way to go about this, and they might consider it, or they may have reasons why they might choose not to use what's recommended in parts of this guideline here. Now I'll pass the baton over to you, Warren, for the next few slides.
All right. Thanks, Jessica. So you completed an investigation under Part 10, Section 10.4. The investigation focused on on dust. Could be, say, flower dust, for example. You've used NIOSH method 0500, particulates not otherwise regulated total. Shown here is NIOSH 0500. NIOSH is the US-based National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. NIOSH is many things, but in this context, they're an organization that provides some standard methods for workplace sampling and analysis. US-based OSHA is another. NIOSH method 0500 carefully identifies that cassettes that are used in sampling should not be overloaded. Shown here is page 1 of the method. Under range, it indicates that the range is 0.1 to 2 milligram per sample. This is shown in the red rectangle expanded on the right-hand side of this page. I'll go into more detail on the next slide. This slide shows a subset of page 2 of NIOSH method 0500 under the title Sampling. I underlined red the location where the method indicates do not exceed a total filter loading of approximately 2 milligrams of total dust. So what is the concern with overloading a sampling cassette? Let's go into this on the next slide. So some possible concerns with overloading. The flow rate of a pump has uncertainty associated with it once you've overloaded it. Pumps are expected to compensate for loading and keep the flow rate the same, regardless of the amount of contaminants on it. But the compensation only goes so far before the pumps are no longer able to compensate. So you may also have some losses of contaminant or dust. Your laboratory partner will likely put a note in your laboratory report. This cassette is overloaded. It's possible that the true concentration in the workplace could be higher than was measured, as shown in the lab report. Now you're authoring the report to a customer related to the dust exposure assessment. The report indicates, the lab report indicates, 3 milligram per meter cubed. This is the measured result. The TWA exposure limit is 10 milligram per meter cubed. As a report author, you must express to your customer or your reader, it's possible that the true concentration could be higher than the measured concentration. Said using different words, it's possible that the measured exposure is an underestimation of actual exposure. The problem, how much of an underestimation is it? You just don't know. The 3 milligram could be 10 milligram per meter cubed, but still under the TWA, but above 50% of the time weighted average limit. But the 3 milligram could also be 12 milligram per meter cubed. Now you're over the TWA. So 3, 7, and 12 are different categories of exposure relative to the TWA. So what's the solution? Consecutive sampling, so taking collection samples over a partial shift of the period. Imagine the work shift starts at 7 a.m. and ends at 3 p.m. You could take one sample for the first part of the shift, say from 7 a.m. to 11 a.m., then another sample from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. So two samples are collected per worker. This does result in more lab costs, but we've reduced the chances of the cassette overloading and reduced the uncertainty. All right, back to you, Jessica.
Great. Thank you, Warren. So here we're going to go over the methods for controlling hazards, or this hierarchy of controls that we've depicted here. So you'll see this concept in standard health and safety reference texts. So we have the highest level of effectiveness at the top, with decreasing effectiveness as you go down that hierarchy of controls. So this graphic loosely follows that sort of traffic light color code thinking, such as a green meaning go, red meaning stop. The bottom three controls here, that awareness, administrative, and personal protective equipment, they rely on human beings to control the hazard, and where the actual hazard still exists. So I'm going to cover the select items in the hierarchy of controls in greater detail in the next slides, as it applies to the implementation of an effective hazard prevention program. So the first two stages of that hierarchy of controls, we have elimination and substitution. So what are some examples of this? We have soldering, for example, without lead. So a solder wire that might not include lead as an ingredient. Solvents that don't have chlorine in it. Avoiding materials with carcinogenic agents in them. And then we can look at engineering controls here specifically. For engineering controls, you can speak to your supplier first. If you have a specific piece of equipment or machinery that you're using, and let's say it's generating a lot of exhaust in the air, for example, there might be a better control for that. So again, speak to your supplier, the manufacturer of that equipment. You may be able to modify the equipment to reduce airborne dust generation. You may be able to enclose the equipment or system, or install something such as local exhaust ventilation, again, to reduce those levels of airborne contaminants. Um, that whole idea of time, shielding, time, distance, those are some key aspects with in terms of reducing your exposure to a hazardous substance, right? The time aspect, the duration of that exposure is pretty key. So the less duration you have, the less exposure, more duration, more exposure, the further you are from whatever is generating that hazardous agent into the air. That's also key. So the further away you are, the less you're exposed. Often we see operators start up equipment, then they may walk away to reduce their airborne exposure, but they might still stay close enough just in case there are machine issues. So that's kind of a practical way to look at this. Shielding could be a vented enclosure. We want to make sure that there isn't a lot of heat buildup whenever you're considering enclosures. So when talking to your supplier, just an example might be, for example, a muffler that's put onto the equipment or the tool, or an air diaphragm pump. Um, Modifying equipment such as using compressed air. Is there a different way to do something There are many in-house resources, for example, in your maintenance department that you might be able to utilize. And there are various ventilation engineering firms as well out there that might be able to look more towards your particular processes, activities at your workplace, and provide you with those tailored solutions to reduce what's being generated into the air. Then we have, the next step in that hierarchy of controls. So there's awareness and administrative controls. Specifically with these types of controls, time. So this was mentioned previously: less duration, less exposure. More duration, more exposure. Um, we really want to try and limit those hours of work to 8 hours. It might not be practical. An example is performing certain types of work in off hours. Might be the afternoon or evening, might be the weekend when there are less employees around. Preventive maintenance. So that maintenance that's regularly or routinely performed on physical assets. Planned scheduled equipment maintenance. This may help reduce that airborne generation of those hazardous substances. Um, let's say a rotation of workers to reduce their exposure. We've definitely seen employees use this. Signage is an example that might be used. So in terms of that respiratory protection or other types of PPE that might be required. And then written procedures. So those also might be of value as well, to make sure that specific instructions are followed to reduce that airborne exposure to those particular hazardous agents. Now we're looking at the very bottom of that hierarchy of controls. So if airborne chemical concentrations cannot be reduced by engineering or administrative methods, then providing personal protective equipment, for example, in the form of respiratory protection, and the related training would be required. In the type of respirators that are used, you can see here, just in that third bullet point, um, we might have other considerations such as, is this hazardous substance a skin irritant? Is there exposure to the eyes that we would need to consider? So there's a lot that requires, there are a lot of requirements that are put onto employees when we consider personal protective equipment. Again, it's sort of a last resort, or it might be in combination with when you're trying to implement those engineering controls. But what do we need to consider for this? We need to consider the work environment. We need to consider those concentrations of the airborne contaminants, the types of respirators, again, that we're using, the materials of construction. Is that PPE material actually suitable for those chemical substances that you are handling? How long are you wearing that PPE? How does it fit, right? Especially for respiratory protection, for those tight fitting respirators, as an example. You want to make sure that those respirators are fit tested, right, on a regular basis, right? Recommended at least every 2 years. Um, Other PPE that you're wearing in combination, could be hard hat, hearing protection, along with the respirators. In terms of protecting yourself against those airborne contaminants, our go-to is a CSA standard Z94.4, most recently updated in 2018, with respect to selection, use, and care of respirators. So again, this is our sort of primary resource once we're considering respirators at the workplace. Is it suitable? Is it providing you with the right degree of protection? So that's a great read there, especially if you do require respirators at your workplace. So we have our poll question number 4 here. So what are airborne chemical exposure concerns in your workplace? Is it that You don't know what airborne chemicals there are at your workplace. There's no hazard investigation conducted for airborne chemicals. Is there evidence of employee illness related to airborne chemical exposure? No or improper controls implemented, or no enforcement of respiratory protection. That can definitely be a tough one for sure. So we'll just give a moment to receive your responses.
I see about, Jessica, about 11 responses have rolled in now. And what are you seeing? I'm seeing the leading is no hazardous investigation conducted for airborne chemicals appears to be the leading at 50%. What else do you see, Jessica? Oh, go ahead.
I see definitely the leading ones, definitely no hazard investigation, not knowing what's in the air at the workplace, um, and no or improper controls implemented. So certainly, I think first off, in any workplace that has chemicals that are used, right? You need to have that discussion with your health and safety committees. You have to have those discussion with those who are handling the chemicals, right? Um, to prompt, is there a hazard investigation that needs to be completed? Is there air sampling that needs to be completed? Do we need additional controls, or controls period at the workplace to reduce employee exposure? Um, it can definitely be, it's something that requires investment for sure, but you need to know what you're handling at the workplace. Is it hazardous to you? You need to start that conversation for sure. So thanks so much everyone for your responses. Now for our next slide here, we have that Part 19 Hazard Prevention Program. Um, this part here, federally regulated employers, they're subject to the hazard prevention program, and it requires the employer to develop, implement, and monitor a program for the prevention of hazards. So the employer must partner with the policy committee, or if there's no policy committee, the workplace health and safety committee, or the health and safety representative. So again, you need to have that conversation. You need to start it. And especially if there are concerns at the workplace, you need to present them, right? And really bring it up the chain, to say, do we need to look further into how these substances are used at the workplace? Do we need to bring a qualified person in? Start that conversation for sure. So what's involved in the hazard prevention program, Part 19? So an implementation plan, hazard identification and assessment methodology, the actual hazard identification and the assessment. So that includes the assessment of the employee's exposure level to the hazard, by way of, let's say, air sampling. And then what comes from that, we might make some recommendations for certain types of controls. And then you would look at preventative measures here, employee training, program evaluation again, and those reports. So it is in quite a bit of detail there, in Part 19, but certainly these are those key elements that you should consider in terms of that program. Um, Now for this slide here, this is the Part 19 guide to support. So the labor program, they have a guide to help detail a bit more the hazard prevention program that an employer should consider at their workplace, in terms of all the hazards that they might have at the workplace. So it came out in 2014 and was last modified in 2022. It's 21 pages long when printed. Seems like a bit of a shorter read, so perhaps something that you might take some time to go through. So here's some paraphrased wording from this guide. So this guide is designed jointly to assist you as an employer, as a member of a policy or workplace committee, or as a health and safety representative, to develop a hazard prevention program that complies with Part 19 of the Canada Occupational Health and Safety Regulations, or COHSR. It suggests a simple, practical procedure to be followed with a view to supporting you in developing and implementing and controlling the application of the prescribed program for the prevention of hazards in the workplace, including the employee education program on occupational health and safety. There is a decision-making framework and sample worksheets to help better understand the regulatory requirements. And then the last poll question here that I'll present to you. So, does your site have a comprehensive hazard prevention program for hazardous substances such as airborne chemicals? So some options here. Yes, a hazard prevention program exists. No, one does not exist. C, in the process of creating or drafting a hazard prevention program. And D, not sure if one exists at all. So I see here, A, yes, a hazard prevention program exists. So at around 65%, that's pretty fantastic that you do have one. Just ensure that it is reviewed regularly, right, to make sure that all of the hazards that are presented in there, the controls, the training, education, all of it is relevant, right, to the current processes, activities that are at the workplace. And then I see here 22%. So in the process of creating or drafting a hazard prevention program. So that's pretty fantastic. If you weren't aware of the guide, now you know, so that you can make sure that you do have all the elements that you need and the level of detail that you need for that program. And for the approximately 7 to 4%, if you're not sure if one exists or no, one does not exist, but perhaps you do need one, again, start that conversation to get things going to make sure that you've done a full review investigation on what's at your workplace, what's in the air, how are you being, what controls are implemented to ensure that you're being or you're in a health or safety, excuse me, you're in a safe and a healthy environment at the workplace. All
All
right,
right.
so I'll pass it over to you, Warren. Thanks so much.
Hey, thanks, Jessica, and thanks again for the 27 responses on the poll. So I might have to pick up the pace here a tiny bit, but certainly in the agenda, you heard me mention the interpretations, policies, and guidelines, or IPGs for short. The IPGs are provided for the IPGs are provided for specific content in the Canadian Federal Acts and Regs. There's a master list of all IPGs. This is the link on the left-hand side of the slide. There's portions of the wording from the ESDC website where you can find the master list of all IPGs. The Labor Program develops interpretations, policies, and guidelines, or IPGs, for specific provisions of the Act and related regulations under responsibility, including the Canada Labor Code, the Employment Equity Act, the Government and the Government Employees Compensation Act. IPGs are intended to ensure that the legislation is interpreted consistently and that the programs are delivered effectively across the country by the Labor Program employees. IPGs are intended to be updated, easily accessible, written in plain language, and based on stakeholder needs and feedback. Shown here is the snip of a specific IPG titled Availability of Safety Data Sheets, and it's got a specific code for the IPG. The link is provided in the reference list. Here's some guidance I see under purpose in this document. Purpose is to provide information about changes to requirements regarding the availability of safety data sheets. So prior to its revision, employers were allowed to make electronic versions of safety data sheets provided by the supplier available to employees and the workplace committees or health and safety representative by means of a computer if the employer took steps to keep the computer working, instructed employees how to use it, and keep the original SDS paper copy available. The effective date for this IPG is September 2017. When printed, the IPG is 1 page in duration. So here I expanded some of the content found on the IPG. For the question below, the answer is provided. There's a lot more great content in this IPG. So the question again is, if the employer prepares electronic versions of the supplier SDS and makes them available to employees, the policy committee, the workplace committee, or the health and safety representative, must that employer also keep a hard copy of the SDS readily available at the workplace at all times? The answer is no. Hard copies are no longer explicitly required to be kept available. The amended definition of readily available in Part 10 of the COHS regulations recognizes the importance of having information readily available without specifying the need for paper copies. Okay, here's another IPG. This topic applies to airborne chemical exposure assessments, but also noise exposure assessments and other physical agents and biological agents too. There's an IPG that relates to the participation of the Safety and Health Committee representative. It's titled Participation of the Safety and Health Representative Committee or Representative, and a portion of it is shown on this slide. I've underlined some of the content in the IPG. There's a mandatory obligation on the committee or the representative to take part and be actively involved from the beginning to the completion of all investigations, studies, inquiries, and inspections. Here, I want to explain the benefits I've received from active participation from the Safety and Health Committee members or representatives. Well, perhaps this is more about the benefits. Say a third party comes to your site. How well received will that third party be? Now imagine that the airborne chemical measurements, measuring instruments, are used and calibrated in front of the Safety and Health Committee or representative. They see the equipment being calibrated before and after use. They see some of the details of the operation of the sampling equipment and that are explained to workers and the safety committee or safety rep as well. Now employees and the safety committee are aware of the principles of the operation, precautions to take while wearing the equipment, and all in efforts to make sure the exposure assessment is most successful. Sometimes during exposure assessment, issues happen. A pump may stop running, the tubing may become detached from the pump, a sampling medium might be oriented incorrectly. Making sure the principles of operation of these sample equipment are clear so that when issues arise, employees and safety reps are aware and corrections can be made as needed to ensure the sampling methods are followed. Explaining the principle of the operation of the sampling builds transparency in the process. This level of transparency helps build trust. In addition, the Safety and Health Committee or representative generally can and generally does provide great workplace insight that the third party would only get from an experienced site contact. It might be content like, hey, today we're working on product Y, but when we work with product X, the exposure associated with this task is much higher, and here's why. Or the changeover between product A and B requires cleaning and sanitizing the equipment. This includes a fair bit of use of a specific cleaner that creates a lot of worker exposure. We need to capture this exposure as well. So, which leads us to poll number 6. Were you aware of the interpretations, policies, and guidelines, or IPGs for short? So I see some responses rolling in, and 80% say yes, 20% say no. And some of you are not unsure. Now it's balancing. I see about 17 responses have rolled in. And thanks so much for your participation. 54% are saying yes, 27% saying no, and about 15% is not 100% sure. So it's useful to take a look at them. You're going to get some references at the back end of this presentation, so you can learn more about IPGs or interpretations, policies, and guidelines. And thanks for the 26 responses in the poll. All right. So we've seen a lot of federal legislation, proposed future legislation in IPGs. Sometimes you may prefer or need to talk to, correspond with, or email a federal government labor affairs officer, health and safety focused, to augment your understanding how content in the act or regulation actually applies. A link is shown on the slide and provided in the reference list. A snip is shown of the first page you see from the link. Pick health and safety in the red rectangle. Note there's several contact mechanisms provided, including form submission, phone, and by mail. I found that the form submission works well. I get responses pretty quickly, at times, same day. In addition to the COHSR, the National Joint Council, or NJC for short, might need to be evaluated. Your employer is subject to it or they are not. If NJC applies, it needs to be addressed. The NJC enhances and supplements the COHSR. A general rule of thumb is provided. In general, the NJC applies for workplaces where the employer is the Canadian federal government and the employees are federal government employees. In general, the NJC does not usually apply for workplaces where the employer is a private firm subject to the Canadian federal legislation. A link for the NJC is provided on the slide and provided in the reference list. Here is a snip of what you might see at first. Now we're digging a bit deeper into the NJC site, looking at the directives. Directives was a drop-down menu from the previous slide. One of the directives is the Occupational Health and Safety Directive, with the most current version dated March 1st, 2022, highlighted with the red rectangle. Within the Occ Health and Safety Directive, there's more specific content under Part 10, Hazardous Substances. Here is a master list or index of topics covered in the Occ Health and Safety Directive under Part 10, Hazardous Substances. You see the titles, Records of Hazardous Substances, Hazardous Investigation, Medical Examinations, Ventilation, Asbestos Management, and Ionizing and non-ionizing radiation. On the right-hand side of the slide, you see related links. I put a red rectangle around one of them. Appendix C, consideration for hazard prevention programs. Let's take a closer look at this content in a future slide. Right, and under scope, highlighted in the red rectangle, this part of the directive enhances and supplements Part 10, Hazardous Substances. To paraphrase, Part 10 of COHSR applies. Whatever you read in NJC, it enhances and supplements Part 10, does not replace it, does not supersede it. Now I'm going to focus on Directive Item 10.2 under the title Hazardous Investigation. If NJC applies under Directive 10.2, the employer shall be required to conduct searches. No employee shall be required to conduct searches for potential chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, explosive, or other threats in the workplace unless it is part of the employee's normal duties and the employee has been instructed and trained in safe methods and procedures. And the employer shall establish written measures and procedures for employees to follow and meet, who may be required to conduct such searches as part of the normal duties. So what's a possible application of this? Here's some possible examples. There's an unusual smell in the workplace, but it appears to be coming from a neighboring company that's unexpectedly emitting some sort of emission. Some employees are concerned about their health. The management and the Workplace Health and Safety Committee become involved in the evaluation, and they may need to protect themselves. Or say shipments of raw materials are coming in wooden crates. These wooden crates normally come in perfect condition, but now all of a sudden the wooden crates have come in with some black mold on them. The wooden crates are normally mold-free. The shipping is receiving employees notify their supervisor. The management and the Workplace Health and Safety Committee become involved in the evaluation. They may need to protect themselves and they may need to wear some respiratory protection to start. Now we're looking at the NJC content, Occ Health and Safety Directive under Section 10.3. Remember, in COHSR, Section 10.7, there was content on medical exams. And now in 10.3, under NJC, medical examinations for employees exposed to hazardous substances shall be administered as required in accordance with the Directive on Occ Health Evaluations, issued by the Treasury Board Secretariat. This leads us to another directive, this time a Government of Canada directive. Let's explore that a bit in the next slide. So this is just a portion of the content of the overall directive on Occ Health evaluations. Here's information on the aim of the directives. The directive aims to prevent or mitigate injuries, illnesses, and fatalities in the workplace and to improve the overall health and safety productivity of employees. It streamlines the planning and use of fit to work assessments and periodic health evaluations linked to staffing requirements. This site was last modified in 2022-0401 or April 1st, 2020. There are many subheadings in this directive, such as effective date, authorities, objectives, and expected results, requirements, roles of other government organizations, and there's more. Under requirements, you'll see the responsibilities for managers and persons employed. Under roles of other government organizations, you will see that Health Canada is responsible for providing all health services. So now we're still looking at NJC content, OC Health and Safety Directive, but now we're looking under Appendix E, Considerations for Hazard Prevention Programs. In this NJC OC Health and Safety Directive under Appendix C, there are many more headings and subheadings. Shown here is the heading Health Hazard Sources, including the subheading Chemical. Let's look a little closer at the wording under the title Appendix E, Consideration for Hazardous Prevention Programs. The following is a representative list of occupational health and safety hazards for which an employee may require administrative controls or the protection provided by personal protective equipment. It should not be considered an exhaustive list. This NJC content has little extra guidance on the hazard prevention program. Up to this point, we've covered select content on Canadian federal acts and regs associated with airborne chemical exposure assessment. We've also talked about future changes, and now we've covered NJC content. Now we want to share some useful guides and some reference text. You completed an investigation under Part 10, Section 10.4. Your exposure to the concerns that you have relative to the ACGH TOB booklet. Exposures are over the ACGH TWA. You've decided that RP is needed as part of the hazard prevention program to protect employees from elevated exposures. You've likely partnered with a reputable safety supplier to get some respiratory protection, but you want to make sure you're using the correct RP. Are there useful guides you may look at in deciding what type of respiratory protection is needed, or at least just get some more information on respiratory protection? Here's a guide you might look at. It's the MSA respirator cartridge chart for Advantage respirators, a type of air purifying respiratory protection. It reviews the particulate, chemical, and combination cartridges for various chemical and chemical classes like organic vapor, chlorine, sulfur dioxide, and so on. It highlights the color coding system for particulates, chemicals, and chemical classes. Black is for organic vapor, and magenta is for particulates, for example. There's other guides that I've seen, such as the 3M respirator selection guide. I see the question in the chat, and yes, they were going to provide the link to this, and it's on the MSA website. You're about to or have completed an investigation under Part 10, Section 10.4. The exposure concerns you have are specific to a certain group of chemicals or chemicals. You want to learn more about these chemicals. You've got the SDS, but you still want more information. Here's a guide you might look at, in this case, specific to isocyanates. From the Government of Canada, or ESDC. The document is titled Isocyanates Control Measures Guideline. This is in the reference list. A snip of the front page is on the right-hand side of the slide. It's 13 pages long and includes information on health effects, occupational exposure limits, Canadian federal regulatory requirements, control measures, additional resources, and references. It is a 2018 document. Here's another guide you might look at, also specific to isocyanates. This is from the Quebec-based IRSST, and it provides a guide titled The Guide for the Safe Use of Isocyanates and Industrial Hygiene Approach. This is in the reference list. A snip on the front page of the guide is on the right-hand side of this slide. It's 94 pages long. It follows the OC hygiene or industrial hygiene approach or model of anticipation, recognition, evaluation, control. It contains very specific information on PPE and RPE when using isocyanates. An example There's examples, case studies as well, and it's the 2013 document. Here's another guide you might look at with respect to silica. It is a WSPS document. I should declare WSPS as my employer. It is titled Silica in the Workplace. This is in the reference list. The snip of the front page of the document is on the right-hand side of the slide. It's 31 pages long and includes information on uses and health effects of silica, assessment and control, and implementing a control program. And it is a 2020 document. You completed an investigation under Part 10, Section 10.4, and you've got elevated exposures relative to the TWA or occupational exposure limit. You're wondering about how often or frequently might I sample this chemical. Here's a guide you might look at to help answer this question. It is published by the American Industrial Hygiene Association. It is titled A Strategy for Assessing and Managing Occupational Exposures, 4th edition. This is in the reference list. A snip of the front page is on the right-hand side of the slide. It's 584 pages long, and yeah, it's 584 pages long. This book was developed by experts with background, training, and experience in exposure assessment and management. It includes information on topics such as exposure assessment strategies, quantitative exposure data interpretations, decision making and statistical tools, and reassessment. It applies to chemical, biological, and physical agents, and it's a 2015 document. The list of references could be much longer and deeper. We could have shared many firms and/or other organizations and chemical-specific documents that they have posted. So we could have shared more content from US-based CDC and/or NIOSH, ACGIH, AIHA, and ASHRAE, to name a few. So we are highly aware that you might already have OC hygiene, safety suppliers, and engineering service providers that you're already partnering with. Or you may have in-house resources for some of these. That's great. The ultimate goal is to prevent OC disease for your employees. There are many organizations that can help with these objectives, and we are just one service option. A list of select WSPS OH focus services is provided here. What follows is the list of references and one final poll. But thanks again for taking time to listen to our presentation titled Airborne Chemical Exposure Assessments, Assessment Awareness, Federal Sector. But first, one final poll. So was there any content that was new to you or that caught your interest the most? And the answers are proposed changes to the Canadian federal legislation, the Labour Canada Hazard Prevention Program Guide, the interpretations, policies, and guidelines, or answers C, and D, the National Joint Council, or E, other. And I see the responses rolling in, and that's great. Thanks so much for the 13 responses so far. Most of you picked the proposed changes to the Canadian federal legislation was number 1. Number 2 was IPG. 25 of you said that was the most the interest or was new to you. And the third was the Canada Labour Code Hazard Prevention Guide. Nobody said National Joint Council, and some said other. Curious what the other is. Maybe it was some of the guides you saw. Anyways, thanks so much for your answers that are rolling in. I see the 20 response and much appreciated. And lastly, just to wrap, it was still the leading answer was A, proposed changes to the Canadian federal legislation. So I do want to share the reference list just so you see it briefly. And you can see, as a follow-up to this, you will receive the reference list. Last thing I do want to say, there's a WSPS is a free federal health and safety newsletter, and you can subscribe to that. It comes out 4 times a year, and you can get updates on amendments to legislation, training, consulting services, awareness of webinars and events, and get some new health and safety resources, and there's a link to subscribe to it. And we also do offer Federal Safety Committee training as well. And it's available in both English and French. And it can be public sessions or you can book online sites. And to register, there's a link there on the WSPS site. All right. Well, Jessica, it's we're at 11:59. We do have some time for Q&A if people have some questions that they'd like to ask. And we see the thank yous coming in from Melanie and Janice and Stefania and Paul. Thanks for your thanks. Dana as well, much appreciated. Anyway, let's see if any questions roll in. But again, thank you people for attending the presentation. Yeah, so I see no immediate questions coming in on the site, and thanks, David.